All right. Hello there. Thank you for joining today. I'm Regina Celestin Williams, the Executive Director at SB at Home, and we're excited to host you for a conversation about California's SB 79, the Abundant and Affordable Homes Near Transit Act, and how we can use this to get the best outcomes for our communities. This Policy in Action at Home series convenes housers to engage on hot housing topics. We select a topic or a current event, bring in an expert to give a brief presentation, and then open up the discussion to ask questions, float new ideas, and we look to identify potential areas for shared action. So before we begin, next slide, please. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamian Nation, and Nama Mutsun on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. So with that, welcome again, and I'll hand it over to our moderator for today's discussion, SV at Home's Director of Policy, Allison Singalani.
Thanks so much, Regina. I am really excited today to welcome Erin Eckhouse with California YIMBY. We have worked together for probably at least 6 years on all kinds of cool stuff. So it's great to have Erin on as a guest today. Erin has spent 8 years at California YIMBY promoting policies to create more affordable, sustainable, and inclusive communities. He now leads work on engaging pro-housing local elected officials and supporting better implementation of state housing policies. Before working at California YIMBY, Erin was a traveling prosciutto salesman, a YIMBY volunteer, and an organizer on the Obama reelection campaign. Erin lives in Oakland, where he enjoys the bounty of California as seen in the farmers market, the beauty of California as seen on hikes, and being near his niece and East Bay bike party. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin for an awesome presentation on California's SB 79. We'll have time for some questions following that. So as questions come up for you during Erin's presentation, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. Thanks a lot, and take it away, Erin.
Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you to SB at Home for organizing this. Really excited to be here. Really excited to be talking about SB 79. This has been something that I personally and California YIMBY as an organization have been working on for the last 8 years. And very excited now as it's law to talk about how we can use this tool to create more housing near high quality transit in California. So I'll start just with an overview. What is SB 79? What is it for? We'll talk about that from the perspective of where it applies, what the development standards and requirements it places on cities are, as well as the eligibility requirements for developments to use SB 79, and then talk about local flexibility to modify SB 79 and how cities can sort of tailor it to their particular contexts. Um, so yeah, big picture, SB 79 sets minimum state zoning standards near very high quality transit. So yeah, we can move on to where. Uh, it defines a category of transit stop called transit-oriented development stops, divided into two tiers, tier one and tier two. In the Bay Area, tier one is BART and Caltrain, specifically Caltrain between Diridon and San Francisco. uh, has the highest development standards. And tier two is light rail and bus rapid transit operating in a dedicated lane. Uh, SB 79 establishes zoning standards based on concentric circles, a quarter mile and a half mile out from the pedestrian access to the transit-oriented development stop. It applies in places that allow residential, commercial, or mixed-use development. So exclusively industrial or open space lands are not covered by SB 79, but most other zoning categories will be. And there are some nuances in this that we'll get to later in the presentation, but just a list there to say that generally it's a half-mile circle, but there are some nuances that cities can apply. So what is required within that half-mile radius? If we move on to the development standards, SB 79 sets development standards based on the quality of the transit in that location and the distance from the stop. So you see concentric circles here, heights of 5 to 7 stories, corresponding floor area ratio. This is specifically its residential floor area ratio, so the city has to allow that much residential floor area. Other uses that the city may want don't come out of that FAR allowance and density. There's a bonus for projects immediately adjacent within 200 feet of the TOD stop. They get a little extra height, FAR, and density. And just a note about these development standards, the city is required to make it possible for development to occur at these standards. So in terms of how this interacts with the city's zoning, the city can't enforce a zoning standard that conflicts with these requirements. If there's a height limit lower than SB 79s, or there's a maximum density lower than SB 79s, but also if, for example, there's a maximum lot coverage that makes it impossible to achieve the residential FAR of SB 79. All of those standards are preempted. Other zoning standards, though, that are consistent with achieving what's allowed by SB 79, a city can enforce. But SB 79 developments can make use of density bonus law. They're protected by the Housing Accountability Act. They're able to make use of SB 35, the new CEQA exemptions, if they meet the qualification standards for those laws. One little nuance here about the interaction of density bonus law and SB 79 we'll get to on the next slide. So SB 79 has eligibility standards for a development to use it. That's an affordable housing requirement, either the amount specified by state law, or if there's a local inclusionary zoning ordinance that requires more affordable housing or more deeply affordable housing, the local IZ ordinance applies instead. There are anti-displacement standards limiting the demolition of rent-controlled housing and requiring compliance with relocation and replacement standards from the Housing Crisis Act. There's a minimum density. There are labor standards from projects over 85 feet. You may recall from the height standards in SB 79 that, generally SB 79 is about developments lower than 85 feet, but in some contexts where local height limits are higher and a project wants to use the greater density or other benefits of SB 79, I would have to meet a labor standard. No hotels, and then there's a limit on bonus height. So this is an interesting wrinkle in the law. If the local height limit is lower than the height allowed under SB 79, the local government is not required to provide additional height through density bonus law. They are permitted to, so, if the city feels like it makes sense in that context to grant bonus height beyond what's provided in SB 79, they're allowed to do that, but they're not required to in sort of recognition of the fact that SB 79 is already exceeding the local height limit. So that I think can transition us into other ways that local governments can customize SB 79 and what provisions it provides for local flexibility. There are two major local flexibility pathways in SB 79. One of them, which applies only within the current RENA cycle, so the sixth cycle in the Bay Area that runs through January of 2031, and the provision for deferral in SB 79 runs 1 year later than that to 2032. And this applies to a specific subset of sites. It can be enacted through a CEQA exempt implementing ordinance. It is subject to HCD review, and it allows the city to defer certain areas from SB 79 until the next RENA cycle. within that next RENA cycle, then they can come up with a more comprehensive plan about how to address the particularities of those areas. The bigger flexibility option that cities have, and it's larger both in the scope of flexibility it provides and also, I think, in the amount of effort that it requires, are local alternative plans. And this is an option for a city to basically write their own version of SB 79 as it applies within their city. The plan would completely replace SB 79. It allows them to increase density in some locations and decrease density in others. It's also subject to HDD review, and it does not have a CEQA exemption. So it would have to go through whatever normal CEQA process would be required. So to get into a little more detail on these, next slide is about the deferral option. So delayed implementation is limited to certain categories of sites and areas. It covers certain environmentally sensitive locations, very high fire hazard severity zones, areas vulnerable to 1 foot of sea level rise, and historical resources that are designated by the local government prior to January 1st of 2025. I think we've seen some situations with historic resource exemptions and other laws that have led to some neighborhoods trying to get themselves designated as a carve out from state housing law. So there's a time by which it must have been previously designated. Cities can defer SB 79 in those areas until the next RENA cycle. Allows them to do a more comprehensive planning process around how do we have transit-oriented growth in the context of fire hazard or in a way that is sensitive to historic resources. There's also provision to defer SB 79 if the city already allows substantial transit-oriented development capacity in that area. That can be either at the site level, so an individual parcel or an individual zoning district that allows at least 50% of the density and floor area allowed under SB 79, the city can defer. Or it can be at the station area level, and that's a requirement for both an aggregate density within the half-mile radius, as well as at least a third of those sites meeting the 50% standard. And then lastly, there's a special allowance for low resource areas. These are designated by the state tax credit allocation committee on the opportunity maps. Um, and those are sort of a hybrid of the sensitive area and adequate existing zoning standard. And there is a lower threshold for adequate existing zoning and low resource areas, as well as a provision for the city to make findings based on citywide capacity. And this is, again, this is to allow a more involved planning process, engaging that community and how transit-oriented development will occur, and creating the time to develop that locally tailored plan. So what can cities do with a local alternative plan, which is the larger flexibility option? We'll get to that on the next slide. Local alternative plans give cities the greatest degree of flexibility. They're also subject to some rules and to review by HCD. So fundamentally, there are 3 rules for a local alternative plan. They have to maintain the same total citywide transit-oriented development capacity as SB 79. So, zoning here is not created or destroyed. It must be conserved. I guess you could create new zoning, but you can't remove density from the plan. You can only shift it to other locations. There's a limit on including very low density zoning within these plans. These are locations with the highest quality transit service in California. We don't want to be locking them behind the gates of exclusionary low density zoning. So there's a minimum density that cities must allow within a local alternative plan. That's 30 units an acre for tier 2 TOD stops. So again, that's light rail and BRT. And it's at least 50% of the standard for tier 1 TOD stops. That'll be 50 to 60 dwelling units per acre and an FAR of 1.5 to 1.75. There are exceptions to that minimum density standard for fire hazard areas, areas vulnerable to sea level rise, and sites with a historical resource. The historical resource exemption, though, is capped at no more than 10% of the station area. If there's an extensive historic district that covers a large percentage of the station area, we believe that the city needs to find a way to accommodate growth within that district. They can still set design standards. They can still set, enforce CEQA around the demolition of historic resources. But again, we don't want there to be provisions to lock housing opportunities out of these neighborhoods entirely. There's also a limit on the maximum density that cities can use in their local alternative plan. And this is just sort of a provision to prevent cities from concentrating all of their development capacity on a handful of sites that may or may not be realistic. And then the last rule for a local alternative plan is that every individual station area has to maintain at least 50% of the total capacity as SB 79. So again, we don't want cities concentrating everything downtown and leaving some transit areas with no opportunities for housing growth. So what you can do with this, you can shift density from one station area to another. So, if San Jose wants to move some of the capacity out of the, uh, South San Jose and into downtown or North San Jose, that would be an option. Can shift density from one part of a station area to another. So if a city wants to increase density along El Camino Real and decrease density in some of the adjacent neighborhoods, that would be allowed within the objective standards specified by the law. And it does allow for cities to zone areas for some areas for exclusively commercial use. So if there's a retail strip that a city is very keen to protect for retail use, they can zone that as an exclusively retail area. Cities are not allowed, though, to maintain single-family zoning in these areas. They're not allowed to designate the entire station area as a historic district. We're in conversations with some cities about this right now. And they're not allowed to hyper concentrate uh, SB 79 development capacity on a handful of sites. There has to be some accommodation for broad-based housing growth because we think this is a really high priority to allow housing, not just on a narrow corridor, but in a broader walkshed that allows a diversity of housing types and allows, people who you know, want to live on a quieter street to not have to be able to buy a multi-million-dollar single family home in order to do that. So next slide. Just close by talking about some of the things we're seeing happen already on SB 79. So one of the things that SB 79 directs is for the MPO, so that's ABAG MTC in the Bay Area, to publish maps of the eligible transit-oriented development stops and the surrounding half-mile areas. They are still working on that, but ABAG has published a guide that if your city has not seen, I really encourage you to take a look. Very helpful summary similar to this about what SB 79 requires and how cities can go about implementing it. The map is in progress. Some cities, though, have produced their own maps and have already started their implementation process. Some of them are making use of the targeted deferrals and exclusions that SB 79 provides. So San Jose is making use of a provision that allows them to exempt large industrial employment areas from SB 79. Mountain View is starting work on a local alternative plan, and in the meantime, deferring eligibility for their historical resources. And Oakland has concluded that all of the low resource areas in the city have sufficient zone capacity that they can defer SB 79. They're also talking about working on a local alternative plan in the next 1 to 2 years. But in the meantime, they're going to defer eligibility for all of the low resource areas, particularly the BRT line on International Boulevard, for those of you familiar with Oakland. San Francisco and Los Angeles are working on kind of a hybrid between the deferrals and a local alternative plan. They are planning targeted rezonings that will enable them to defer SB 79 citywide. And they've identified, somewhere about 10 to 15% of the area covered by SB 79 that isn't currently eligible for any of the deferrals that I've mentioned, that they're going to rezone to bring it up to capacity that allows for them to pause SB 79 citywide, with the then ability to work on a full local alternative plan in the next RENA cycle. San Francisco and LA, they're able to do that because they've done broader citywide rezonings as part of their housing element process. And then two other smaller cities in Southern California are working on local alternative plans. Beverly Hills actually submitted the very first local alternative plan to HCD. I believe they made a math error in calculating capacity, though, so they're going to have to rework that. Culver City is working on one that's they're going through a little more involved process. Um, I will say, any of your cities who are working on SB 79 implementation and you have questions or you see something happening, I would really love to know about it. We're very interested in tracking SB 79 implementation. We obviously put a lot of work into this bill, and many of our co-sponsors who put a lot of work into this bill are continuing to be invested in how implementation moves forward. So with that, I would love to take questions.
Thanks so much, Erin. That was a lot. So thank you for covering all that super pithy content. Really appreciate it. We are getting some questions coming in, and I have some questions for you as well. I'll take some moderator's privilege there. We can probably stop SlideShare for now. Thank you. We did have a question about event recording and slides. We will be sharing both the event recording and the slides to everyone who registered for the event, so keep an eye out for that. So first, I just want to note there is a lot of flexibility in SB 79. So clearly there is an intent to have a lot more density around high quality transit that can both support transit ridership and also give people great access to the ability to get around without having to get in a car and add to traffic and greenhouse gas emissions. Um, but lots of flexibility for local priorities and alternative plans. I did want to ask you to elaborate a little bit about the role or roles of HCD, which is California's Department of Housing and Community Development, and kind of what those processes might look like. I know we're a little ahead of the game, so some of that is uncertain.
Yeah. So SB 79 gives HCD sort of enforcement and implementation authority around the law. And for HCD, that generally means they'll provide guidance and technical assistance to cities. And it also, in this case, means that they will be reviewing implementing ordinance, and any city submitting a local alternative plan will have to submit that to HCD for review so that HCD can confirm, yes, you are meeting all of the requirements of the law, or let cities know, no, what you're doing here is a misinterpretation. You're not actually allowed to do that. You can do it this way instead. Um, I know some cities have felt a lot of pressure. SB 79 zoning standards go into effect on July 1st. There's a 90 to 120-day review window for HCD to look at local ordinances. Some cities have felt, oh my God, we have to get our ordinance in, 90 to 120 days before July 1st. What I have told cities is, the ordinance, there's a provision later on, a local alternative plan can't take effect until HCD has approved it. That's not the case for a local implementing ordinance, a local deferral option between now and July 1st. So I think cities generally are better off taking time to develop an ordinance that you are confident meets the requirements of the law and submitting it in June, than you are scrambling to get something in this month and, making an error as a result. Um, yeah, but generally, I think we're copying also, I would say, one, there's precedent for HCD reviewing local ordinances implementing state law. We copy this provision from ADU law. I think generally that has worked well and it has helped HCD produce a really extensive body of technical assistance for cities. It's going to take them some time to compile that for SB 79. I know I've heard from them that generally they like to wait to get questions from cities before they put out proactive guidance because they want to know what do we need to clarify. And then we did work to make sure that the local alternative plan process would think about how it interacted with housing element law and also the rules about local alternative plans are sort of they're objective standards that are responsive to some of the confusion that seemed to develop around the most recent housing element updates, where sometimes cities felt like, well, we don't know what HCD wants from us. A lot going on there, but one of the reasons we set those rules for local alternative plans is to make it possible for cities to know in advance, yeah, what we're doing meets the requirements or doesn't.
Got it. That makes sense. You mentioned implementing ordinances. I wanted to ask if SB 79 requires a local ordinance to implement.
Yeah, SB 79 does not require any local implementing ordinance. It is the law, it is state law, whether or not local government chooses to take any proactive step to incorporate it into their local standards. I think we do see advantages to all parties involved, to cities passing local implementing ordinances in terms of clarifying things for their staff and for applicants. And also, the local implementing ordinance is the pathway by which a city makes use of the deferred implementation options in the law. So if a city wants to, pause SB 79 implementation on historical resources or low resource areas or fire hazard zones, the mechanism for them to do that is a local implementing ordinance, at which point they should also be accounting for how SB 79 standards integrate into their local review process and zoning.
Got it. Can you talk a little bit about protections in SB 79 to help ensure that existing residents, especially renters, lower income residents, are not displaced from transit areas where SB 79 applies?
Yeah. So three things, I guess, to comment about that. One is that SB 79 includes very strong protections against direct displacement. Any development that's replacing existing rental housing will have to meet requirements from the Housing Crisis Act to provide relocation assistance to any current residents and to current low-income residents or residents of rent. We'll get to rent control later, and replace those existing units. There's also a very strict limitation on the demolition of existing rent-controlled housing with no more than 2 units. So the 2 unit threshold is really about weird edge cases in some cities that when you add an ADU to a single family home, will bring the ADU and the single family home into rent control.
Mhm.
Um, but generally, existing rent controlled apartments are off limits for demolition under SB 79. Any situation in which rental housing is replaced will have the requirements of SB 330. And then I would also add, sort of the status quo on land use and zoning in California has been the only place that you can build apartments is where apartments already exist. And that puts a lot of pressure actually on our existing rental stock because those are the only buildings that you can redevelop for more housing in many cases. And so SB 79 changes that dynamic by allowing more housing in places that are not currently full of apartment buildings. It creates a lot more opportunities to build new housing without having to displace the current residents. So that's one of the reasons this has been such a priority for California YIMBY over the years. And one of the things we're really excited about with this is we're upending a dynamic that has perpetuated exclusion, but also perpetuated displacement by concentrating the opportunities for new housing where existing rental housing is.
Got it. So right now, mobile home parks are one of Silicon Valley's few sources of affordable homeownership opportunities. We're hoping that that changes. There's a lot in the works in that direction. We've heard a lot of concern in particular about Sunnyvale's mobile home parks, because they're protected only by a memorandum of understanding or a MOU and not by a city ordinance. Can you talk a little bit about efforts at the state to ensure that mobile home parks are protected?
Yeah, so this is something that was brought to our attention last year, just too late for us to amend it into SB 79. I think Senator Wiener, the author of SB 79, immediately he submitted a letter to the Journal like, yes, my intention is that mobile home parks should be protected in the way that existing rental housing is protected. Senator Wahab, who represents Sunnyvale, is sponsoring a bill this year to add mobile home parks to the exclusion criteria for SB 79 eligibility. That bill is moving forward with an urgency clause, so it will take effect as soon as it's through the legislature and signed by the governor. And so I think our expectation is that prior to July 1st, the law will be amended so that uh, sites with mobile home parks are not eligible for development under SB 79.
Thank you. For folks who may not be as familiar with that, mobile home parks are kind of particularly vulnerable because mobile home park residents typically own their mobile homes but are renting the land beneath it. And despite the name, mobile homes are not actually very mobile. Once they're on a space, they're kind of there. So it does put mobile home residents sometimes in a tricky situation. Erin, are you able to speak to any of we talked about one potential SB 79 cleanup bill. Are there others in the works at the state, and what might be included in this?
Yeah, so we are working with RSB 79 co-sponsors and with Senator Wiener on a follow-up bill. That bill will be SB 908 from Senator Wiener. It's in print right now purely as intent language, so you won't learn much from it. Generally, our intention with that bill is to clarify definitions within SB 79, but not to make major policy changes. And I will speak to there have been some some groups pushing, for example, to further delay implementation of SB 79. I don't think that's something that we're interested in doing. We think the law is in good shape for July 1st. And we're not intending major policy changes. So, uh, but there will be more detailed language in print in the next month.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Speaking of July 1st, on July 1st, can a city block an SB 79 project if their alternative plan has not yet been approved by HCD?
So no. On July 1st, SB 79 zoning standards are the law of California. Um, if a local government has passed an implementing ordinance prior to July 1st, that ordinance would be in effect and it will set the standards under which an SB 79 project would be reviewed by the city. It may defer coverage of SB 79 in certain areas, as we've discussed, uh, but they can't just say no. They have to have they have to have identified something about like, well, okay, this is why this area is not covered by SB 79 right now.
Awesome. Thank you. We have a question here. I think we've probably covered this, but just to clarify, do cities need to develop a new ordinance with new zoning? So do the zoning, the general plan, SB 79, all need to align, or can they just accept developments that meet the new standards of SB 79 as they come along?
The latter. So a city
Okay.
doesn't have to create a new zoning ordinance under SB 79. Uh, I think many cities are moving forward with an overlay as a way of integrating SB 79 into their local zoning code, um, which I think is certainly like near term, probably the easiest way to do it. I would encourage cities as they get to like a comprehensive planning update milestone, such as the next housing element, to think about revising their zoning map and their zoning code to align with SB 79 because I think it will probably make everything easier, including, any question about like, well, can we impose this zoning standard or not for SB 79 projects? But no, SB 79 can be processed, in the same way that maybe they would process density bonus or AB 2011 project as something that is allowed under state law and separate from the local zoning code.
Awesome. I'm looking at who we have in the call today and noticing it's a pretty wonky audience. So this next question for the housing element, for sites that are included in the site inventory, if a site develops at a density that is lower than what the city has anticipated, they can kind of move some of that capacity around to other sites in the city. They can accept the lower density development. If developers want to develop a high density project that isn't as high or as dense as SB 79 numbers, but are within the zoning that the city had gotten approved previously in their housing element, can developers move forward on those projects? In other words, can the city kind of shift capacity around to other sites in real time if a lower density development is proposed where SB 79 applies?
Well, so there's no requirement within SB 79 to maximize the density of the site. There are incentives to do so. So projects that are building at least 75% of the maximum density allowed under SB 79 get extra incentives and concessions if they're using density bonus law, with the number of those incentives or concessions tied to the level of affordability they provide. So, three extra concessions with extremely low income housing, two extra concessions with very low income housing. Um, but there's not, for example, a no net loss thing. If SB 79 allows 100 units on the site and somebody proposes building 50, okay, we got 50 new homes and we don't feel like the other 50 were lost and need to be made up somewhere else. Uh, we got 50 new homes that weren't there before. I think our sense of the maximum densities in SB 79 is we want them to be permissive and not prescriptive, I think we recognize that it may or may not make sense on any given site to build up to that maximum possible density. There is a minimum density requirement. So, it has to be at least 30 units per acre, it has to be at least 5 units. Some cities like San Jose have their own local density, minimum density requirements. Those would continue to apply. Um, but if a site is building less than the maximum capacity allowed under SB 79, mm, there's no there's no requirement to like identify an alternative for the rest.
Got it. Thank you. Um, you mentioned pedestrian access points. This can be a little bit tricky. Can you talk a little bit more about the way pedestrian access points to transit stops are defined and how that impacts where SB 79 applies?
Yeah. So that process is currently being worked out by the Metropolitan Planning Organizations and HCD. Um, I think generally, uh, in some cases, it's relatively straightforward. A subway station has however many places you can enter the subway station, right? Those are the pedestrian access points. Um, there's a variety with a variety of transit types covered by SB 79. I know people who are working out, for example, a light rail stop. Is it the entirety of the curb where the train pulls up? If it's a platform, is it the ramp onto the platform or the staircase onto the platform? For a bus stops, is it the flag? Some of this is uh, there's some GIS data available on this to like the GTFS for transit stops. Some of it, I think, the MPOs and cities and also like I've talked to a few academics who are working on this, are working on these data sets themselves. Um, but yeah, that one is a little bit of a work in progress in terms of the agencies responsible for implementation.
Got it. Is this something that might be included in the SB 908 cleanup bill?
We haven't talked about it, yeah, that
Oh,
it
thank
hasn't
you.
come up. Nobody has asked us for that, honestly. So, If somebody wants to ask for it, we can then talk about it. But yeah,
Got it. Looks like we need to have someone off of mute there. Um, for the purposes of implementing SB 79, does the provision allowing removal of sites where there's no walking path of less than 1 mile apply only when the site lacks such access to the same transit-oriented development stop that generated the assigned capacity? Or is it required that the 1 mile walking path be measured to any qualifying transit stop covered by the bill? That's a tricky question. Let me know if you want me to repeat that.
I saw that one. That's a very interesting question, and it's got me thinking. Um, I'm trying to pull up the law right now and refer specifically to exactly what it says. Um, I think we were thinking about it. Well, is the walking path to the designated stop? But I think it may be written as no walking path to any transit-oriented development stop. I can also, I guess, speak to like the context in which we're thinking about this. Um, was particularly San Diego. And the topography of San Diego is such they have these like mesas and ravines. And so you might have a transit stop that's on one side of the ravine, and then a half mile away is the other side of the ravine, but you can't actually walk across the ravine. I know they have stops that are on like one side of a river, and there's no river crossing at the site of that stop. So those are the contexts we're thinking about it. At the time we were writing that, we had some stops that were like uh, within a half mile of the stop was an island. So again, that's like the island is not actually, you could develop on the island, but it wouldn't actually be transit oriented. Um, so that's the context in which we were thinking about it. I would encourage, look at the exact text, and that's a great question for HCD and your MPO as well.
Sounds good. Um, on that note, I may have missed it, but transit stops and the kind of buffer, like a half-mile buffer around transit stops, don't necessarily fall neatly along the boundaries of cities. Can you talk a little bit about how that might show up and how cities might need to be really thoughtful about um, where the transit stations are that they're responsible for planning around?
Yeah. Um, So yeah, as you said, city lines, they do weird things and oftentimes transit stops may be at or near a city boundary. The half mile radius, the quarter mile radius extend across city boundaries. There's sort of a semi-exception for cities with a population below 35,000. They only have to plan for a quarter mile radius around the transit stop. And so there are some interesting locations where, there's a stop in a small city, quarter mile, and then within a half mile, there's a boundary of a larger city. And so there may be a gap in the TOD zone. Um, I know some cities have been like mapping this. Los Angeles has at least one TOD stop in another city that the half mile radius extends into the city. I know San Jose has a couple. I know Oakland has one. So yes, it's a good thing for cities to be aware of is that the TOD stop doesn't have to be within your city for the TOD area to extend into your city. And that's one of the reasons I think we wanted a regional entity to do the mapping, is that you know, they have that regional scope.
Right. Um, Sounds great. So speaking of San Jose, San Jose has a large area of industrial land, or actually several of them, but especially in North San Jose, that they're working to come through that exemption process to try to protect that land and ensure that there's jobs producing land remaining in the city. So you talk a little bit about kind of when you have areas of land um, that would otherwise qualify for SB 79 that are that large, kind of what that process looks like to shift capacity into other parts of the city.
Yeah. So this is something that we worked with the city of San Jose on in developing the bill, and it was a major concern for them. It's a pretty narrowly tailored provision that they're using. It only applies in cities with at least 15 transit-oriented development stops. So I think that's San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland, San Diego, and Los Angeles. It applies to very large areas, at least 250 acres, that are zoned primarily for industrial use and that do not allow residential use at all. The concern from San Jose is they have some areas that are zoned for like industrial in the general plan, but also allow commercial use. And so SB 79 could apply there on the basis of the allowed commercial use. So for areas that meet that narrow set of criteria, they're actually exempt from SB 79 with no need to capacity shift. And then part of the thinking about that is, again, San Jose has 50 TOD stops. Uh, so they're going to have extensive transit-oriented development coverage through the law. Uh, we provided some ability for them to maintain the jobs for areas with a recognition also, right, that we want a lot more housing near transit, but uh, people need destinations on transit as well. So that was the thinking with the employment areas is major employment hubs.
That makes good sense. Can you talk a little bit about, so SB 79 also gives makes some adjustments to land use authority for transit agencies.
Mhm.
How does that interact with the land use authority of cities? And have you seen kind of best practices for what that looks like in terms of working together? I know it's early days of SB 79 implementation.
Yeah. So SB 79 gives transit agencies land use authority on land that they own, either adjacent to or within a half mile of transit-oriented development stops. Uh, for land that's not adjacent to the stop, there's an acquisition date that it has to be owned by the agency by. And it defines a process for them to rezone that land to set allowed uses, height, density, and floor area ratio. It ties those standards to what's allowed in SB 79. So a transit agency can't zone for significantly greater, for much more height than is allowed under SB 79. They can double the density, double the FAR, and they have to allow at least what is allowed by SB 79. So they can't set, a low density zoning. I think the biggest thing that this allows transit agencies to do is include some amount of non-residential commercial development at these station areas. There are limits on that. They have to develop affordable housing in conjunction with any non-residential use and open the affordable housing before they're able to open the non-residential use. Um, the process involves consultation with local governments. It involves a hearing at the transit agency board. It allows for cities to adopt zoning that is consistent with the standards set by the transit agency. So it's rather involved. I know we have someone from VTA in the audience. Would love to talk about uh, how VTA is looking at this. Um, I think we're interested in hearing from transit agencies about like how does this work for you? How can we make it work better? I think we want to see transit-oriented development by transit agencies work as both a ridership driver for agencies and also as a direct revenue source. We see this in many other parts of the world where transit agencies get significant revenue from real estate development at their stations because there's value in having that type of proximity to transit. And so we want to provide a mechanism for transit agencies to capture some of that value so that they can run better quality service for all their riders.
Sounds good. Thank you. We are coming down toward the close. We have time for maybe just a couple more questions. So if you have a burning question, please make sure to get it into the Q&A now. Erin, I think I know the answer to this one, but for purposes of implementing SB 79, can you designate sites after January 1st, 2025 as historic as part of the local transportation alternative plan and have them excluded under that section of the bill? Similar to how commercial sites may not be excluded unless you adopt a local transportation alternative plan.
Yeah. So, great question. For deferred implementation, the site has to be designated prior to January 1st, 2025. For a local alternative plan, there's no time cutoff. What there is a cap of 10% of the TOD area that can be exempted from the minimum density requirements on the basis of being a historical resource. So it's two different mechanisms. The local deferral, we wanted it to be like very quick and straightforward. So it's just, here's your time cutoff. Anything from before that time cutoff, you can defer until the next planning cycle. The local alternative plan, because it's a more involved process, and because you have to shift that capacity somewhere else, we didn't put the same time cutoff, but we did put a limit on how much of any given station area can be sort of zeroed out. You could still do lower density zoning in the historic districts beyond that 10% cap, uh, but only 10% can be set at, you know, no housing.
Awesome. Thank you. Probably the last question we'll have time for today. For purposes of implementing SB 79, would you include sites that are designated for public facilities, like in San Jose, public, quasi-public, government buildings, public schools, as being zoned for commercial development?
Uh, Probably not, but um, it's also a good question, I think, for HCD to weigh in on. I think we are thinking about commercial development. Uh, I would encourage cities to look at AB 2011 as a model there in terms of office and retail as sort of the of type type cases of commercial development.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Erin, thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge on this. Thank you to all of our attendees for asking such great questions. Um, Erin, you have shared with me that that some local jurisdictions are already starting to submit alternative plans. You shared with me one that had kind of a simple math error, but we're also seeing that there are a lot of questions about kind of the complexity of how this bill takes place at the local level. So for our call to action today, we really want to encourage folks who have questions about this, folks who are watching this implementation take shape in their cities, to reach out to Erin, reach out to California YIMBY, reach out to HCD as you have questions on this so that we can make sure that SB 79 does the best possible job for our communities and helping to concentrate people around transit, which is both going to support the transit that we need to keep our Bay Area communities thriving, and also help create great places for people where where it reduces traffic, where it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, great for the environment, great for people. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you, Erin, for dropping your email address in there. I expect you'll get a flood of emails, as will HCD.